Welcome. My name is Felix Cortez. I'm Associate Professor of New Testament Literature at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University. This is the seminar, In These Last Days, the Message of Hebrews. The purpose of this seminar is to explore the historical context of the letter to the Hebrews, one of the most important books of the Bible for Adventist believers because it focuses on the priestly ministry of Jesus in the heavenly sanctuary. You will notice that there is a close relationship between the circumstances in which the readers of Hebrews lived and the circumstances in which you and I live today. I hope that you will be blessed as we explore together the remarkable and inspiring portrait of Jesus in the letter to the Hebrews. Hebrews is a rare document. Though sent as a letter, Hebrews was probably not intended as a letter, but as a sermon. The author describes the document as a word of exhortation, which was the expression that first-century Jews and Christians used to refer to the sermon in the synagogue as well as in the Christian church. Thus, the letter describes the author as a speaker, not as a writer. Though rare, however, Hebrews is a beautiful piece of literary art. Harold Attridge, probably the best-known expert on Hebrews, has said that Hebrews is the most elegant and sophisticated, and perhaps the most enigmatic text of first-century Christianity, a masterpiece of early Christian rhetorical homiletics. Hebrews is also enigmatic. After almost 2 millennia of study, scholars do not agree on the answer to 6 of its most basic questions. Who wrote it? To whom it was written? When it was written? Is it a letter or a sermon? What is its literary structure? And how should we understand its symbolic language? Hebrews was probably written by the Apostle Paul from Rome between the years 60 and 65 AD to Hellenistic Jewish Christians that lived in Jerusalem. We know that the author was male because he used the Greek masculine participle diegumenon, to tell. He used this participle in Hebrews 11:32 to refer to himself. We also know that he was possibly in jail when he wrote the letter because his movements were restrictive. He also refers to Timothy, and the only Timothy we know from early Christian sources was the companion of Paul. The kind of topics and images that the author chooses suggest that he was probably of Jewish origin. Likewise, his argumentation is closer to Jewish midrash than to other systems of reasoning. He was also probably well educated and enjoyed rhetorical training. Most importantly, Hebrews always appears in New Testament manuscripts as part of the Pauline letter collection. The Chester Beatty Papyrus P46, which is the earliest manuscript of Hebrews and of the Pauline letters, which was produced in the year 2000 AD, places Hebrews right after Romans. Hebrews already bears the title To the Hebrews, which follows the way Pauline letters were identified and is different from the way Catholic letters were identified. The question that remains then is, why did Paul or the author not identify himself? We know that the audience knew him, knew who he was. He asked them to pray for him. Was Paul trying to protect the addressees from persecution as some people have suggested? We don't know it. Hebrews was also probably written from Rome. This is clearly suggested by the fact that Paul includes the greetings of the Italians who were with him, as was the custom in the early Christian churches. This suggests that Paul wrote Hebrews between the year AD 60, the time he first arrived in Rome, and around the year AD 65, when he died there according to tradition. Paul is probably writing to a group of Hellenist Jewish Christians who live in Jerusalem. That is, Jewish Christians whose first language was Greek and had been born outside Palestine. They were immigrants into Palestine. It is possible that the readers had moved to Jerusalem to receive further education, just like Paul himself had done. Another possibility is that they had moved to Jerusalem to participate in the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, which they believed will be fulfilled soon. Note as well that the author distinguishes his readers from the leaders of the congregation, as well as from other Christians that lived in the area. It is also possible that Paul knew at least some of them from the time when he lived in Jerusalem before his conversion. The argument of Hebrews suggests that the audience of Hebrews had a problem of double allegiance. They had difficulty in understanding the meaning and implications of Jesus' priestly ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. They were slow to recognize that Jesus' death, ascension, and ministry in the heavenly sanctuary had made obsolete the priesthood, the temple, and the sacrifices of animals in Jerusalem. They were Jewish Christians who, though having accepted Jesus in their past, remained loyal to Jerusalem temple and its rituals. Acts provides evidence that Jewish believers continued to offer sacrifices many years after the death and ascension of Jesus Christ. The argument of Hebrews is that such sacrifices were obsolete and soon to disappear, and that they should not continue to be offered. In fact, the author suggests that continuing to offer these sacrifices could lead eventually to the rejection of Jesus and his sacrifice. Let's talk about the first assertion of the letter. The first assertion of the letter, and probably the most important, was that in these last days, God has spoken to us in his Son. The context of the letter is clearly eschatological. The readers of Hebrews did not know it yet, but their world was going to end within the next 10 years. The destruction of Jerusalem and Jewish society will be cataclysmic and tragic, like the flood and the fall of Babylon, a time of trouble as the world had not yet seen. The author believed that the end was approaching fast. The signs that the end was approaching were increasing in number and intensity. The clouds began to gather with the ascension of Gaius, whom the soldiers called Caligula. This happened in AD 37. The next year, the Jews of Alexandria suffered pogroms that culminated with the public scourging of 38 Jewish elders on August 31. Around 2 years later, offended that a Jew had pulled down an altar to him in the city of Jamnia, Gaius ordered the legate of Syria, Publius Petronius, to set up a gigantic statue of him in the temple in Jerusalem. This order threatened to trigger the worst crisis since the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 to 164 BC. It surely reminds the followers of Jesus of his prediction less than 10 years earlier that an abomination of desolation would stand in the holy place. Fortunately, Gaius was assassinated on January 24, AD 41, before the order could be carried out. Paul most likely alluded to this event around 10 years later, when suggested that Gaius' attempt to set up his statue in the temple in Jerusalem prefigured what the man of lawlessness would later do in the temple of in the temple of God, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. In AD 41, Claudius forbade Jews in Rome to gather together in accordance with their ancestral way of life. 8 years later, AD 49, Claudius expelled them, all the Jews, from Rome due to the constant riots at the instigation of a certain Chrestus, which some scholars think may have been a mistaken reference to Christ, suggesting that these disturbances were caused by conflicts between Jews and Christians. From AD 46 to AD 48, a famine hit Palestine and surrounding territories. Agabus, a Christian prophet, predicted this famine, and the Christians from Antioch sent relief to Christians in Jerusalem through Barnabas and Paul. The famine, aggravated by high taxes, the oppression of the Roman occupation, and the extreme polarization between the rich and the poor frayed the social fabric. Josephus tells us that around that time, a false prophet named Theudas arose in Palestine. He convinced a large number of people to take their property and follow him into the wilderness across the Jordan River, which, at his command, would divide as Joshua had parted the ways or the waters of the Jordan before. The plan seemed to be that God will prepare them in the desert for the new conquest of Palestine. Cuspius Fadius, however, the Roman procurator at the time, dispersed the movement, executed Theudas, and exhibited his head in Jerusalem. About 10 years later, around AD 55, a Jewish prophet known as the Egyptian, Acts 21:38, invited his followers to march from the wilderness to the Mount of Olives and then into Jerusalem. Felix, the Roman governor, slaughtered many of them and scattered the movement, but there would be many others like them. By 59 AD, the time of Paul's last travel to Jerusalem recorded in the Bible, Palestine was in turmoil. Felix, who according to Tacitus practiced every kind of cruelty and lust, was the governor. The high priest was Ismail ben Fiabi, a thug. In an ancient lament bemoaned, "Woe is me because of the house of Ishmael ben Fiabi. Woe is me because of their thuggery. For they are high priests, and their sons treasurers, their sons-in-law trustees, and their slaves beat up on the people with clubs." No wonder that Paul, as he prepared to travel, requested prayers that he may be protected and delivered from the unbelievers in Judea. Hebrews was probably written around AD 62, towards the end of Paul's first imprisonment in Rome. That same year, James, the brother of Jesus and leader of the church in Jerusalem, was assassinated by the temple authorities. When Porcius Festus died suddenly in office, the high priest Annas the Younger, whom Josephus describes as an insolent man, saw an opportunity. He convened the Sanhedrin, accused James of breaking the law, and condemned him to be stoned to death, which he would not have the power to do had there been a Roman governor in office. Josephus tells us that there were many foreboding signs of the fall of Jerusalem. He especially relates that in the Feast of Tabernacles, that same year, AD 62, the year in which Paul probably wrote Hebrews, a certain Jesus, son of Ananias, an untrained peasant, stood up in the temple and began to cry, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegroom and the brides, and a voice against these whole people." He continued to cry this warning taken from Jeremiah's temple sermon, despite beatings and floggings by the authorities for 7 years and 5 months until he died in AD 69 during the siege of Jerusalem. Jewish society had begun to unravel. It was probably around that time that Hellenistic believers in Jerusalem received Paul's letter about Jesus, the Son, seated at the right hand of God, a powerful and merciful priest, interceding in their behalf in a time of need. There are two kinds of material in the letter to the Hebrews. There are theological arguments and exhortatory appeals. Scholars and students today focus mainly on the theological exposition of the letter, which is significantly rich. But the author considered that the letter as a whole was an exhortatory appeal, a word of exhortation. This suggests then that the theological argumentation of the letter was the purpose, or has the purpose, of establishing the foundation for the author's appeal to the audience. The exhortatory appeal of the author is summarized 2 times in the letter, Hebrews 4:14-16 and Hebrews 10:19-25. These two paragraphs are the most important markers of the structure of Hebrews and function as the twin towers of the San Francisco Golden Gate, summarizing and supporting the argument of the letter as a whole. They divide Hebrews in three great sections. Hebrews 1 through 4 focuses on Jesus' ascension or enthronement at the right hand of God as king and priest. Hebrews 5 to 10 focuses on Jesus' priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. And also on the new covenant he has inaugurated through his sacrifice for us. Hebrews 10 to 13 is a call to faith and perseverance and to work for one another in brotherly love. The idea that Jesus is a ruler seated at the right hand of God is very important for us because it describes Jesus as our leader and defender. Jesus defends us from the devil and he leads us into the rest of God, which refers to the fulfillment of God's eschatological promises for his people. Hebrews 2:14 through 16 describes Jesus as a divine warrior. The Old Testament describes God on several occasions as a champion who engages in individual combat on behalf of his people. For example, Isaiah 42:13 says, "The Lord goes forth like a soldier. Like a warrior, he stirs up his fury. He cries out. He shouts aloud. He shows himself mighty against his foes." Jesus described himself as a champion who overpowers Satan and divides his plunder. Probably the most similar passages in this tradition is Isaiah 49 verses 24 to 26. Can the prey be taken from the mighty, or the captives of a tyrant be rescued? But thus says the Lord, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken, and the prey of the tyrant be rescued. For I will contend with those who contend with you, and I will save your children. Jesus, whose divine identity is asserted in Hebrews 1, is this champion who takes on the devil in a soul combat to deliver his brethren. He reminds us of the young David who defeated Goliath to deliver his brethren who cowered as the giant threatened them. The devil had the power of death, and human fear of death leads to lifelong slavery to the devil. But the author does not explain how. Hebrews 2:14 to 15 operates on the basis of the biblical teaching that sin leads to death and to God's judgment. Thus, because of their sin, human beings have a fearful expectation of being judged and punished as adversaries. This is the fear of death that maintains us away from God and enslaved to the devil. Jesus, however, destroyed the power of the devil and delivered us from the fear of judgment by dying as a propitiation for the sins of the people. Hebrews 2:17. Making in this way possible forgiveness and reconciliation with God. Jesus also broke the power of sin by giving us the power to live a righteous life through the fulfillment of the new covenant promise of writing the law in our hearts. Thus, Jesus has effectively liberated us from slavery to the devil so that we can now serve the living God. By providing propitiation, Jesus stripped the enemy of his weapons and vanquished him. But his final destruction will come in the future. The author exhorts his readers to respond to Jesus' victory by accepting God's invitation of entering his rest. The rest refers to the promised land that God offered his people when he delivered them from slavery in Egypt. Now, after delivering us from slavery to sin and the devil, God invites us to enter the rest of God that refers to the heavenly homeland mentioned in Hebrews 11. The author argues that Joshua was not able to lead the people into the rest. He argues that the fact that the promise of rest was repeated in Psalm 95 implies that Israel did not enter the rest or this rest in the time of Joshua. Hebrews 4:8 says, if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not have afterward spoken of another day. This must mean then that the rest God had promised Israel was more than the possession of and absence of conflict in the land of Canaan. The author argues that it involved a state, the state God entered on the Sabbath of creation when he rested on the seventh day. The rest God promises to believers is a return to Eden, a return to the original goodness of creation, an entrance into a perfect land, a perfect world like it was the case at creation. Therefore, the rest is not only a place, but is defined as a Sabbath rest in a perfect place. There is then an implied progression in the argument of the letter. Chapters 3 and 4 present Jesus as the leader, prefigured by Joshua, who guides believers into the full rest of God. Hebrews 5 to 7 present Jesus as the high priest, prefigured by Melchizedek, who provides perfection to us. And Hebrews 8 to 10 present Jesus as the mediator of a new covenant, prefigured by Moses, who provides access to the presence of God at the heavenly sanctuary. The new Joshua leads us to the rest. The new Melchizedek provides perfection, and the new Moses inaugurates a new covenant which provides access to God. Therefore, the Sabbath rest of Hebrews 4 functions in the argument of the letter as a symbol of all the benefits of the new covenant that Jesus has made available to us by grace. This is the heavenly inheritance that Hebrews 11 to 13 exhort us to make every effort to enter. For the author of Hebrews, then, every Sabbath that we observe is a memorial of God's rest when he finished the creation of the world, but is also a celebration in advance of the coming world, the perfect world he is preparing for us. When we keep the Sabbath, we do not only recognize him as our creator who made the world in 6 days. We also recognize him as our redeemer who is restoring the world to its original glory. The author explains that Jesus is the heavenly priest and heavenly leader who will lead us into the ultimate rest. Hebrews also says that Jesus is priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek in Hebrews 5 to chapter 10, verse 18. And this is the second major section in the argument of Hebrews. This section introduces Jesus as the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek and his sacrificial death to inaugurate a new covenant between God and Israel. This is the second important argument of Hebrews. Jesus' priestly ministry has provided for us confident access through the veil, that is, into the very presence of God at the sanctuary. The transition from the discussion that Jesus has been seated at God's right hand as ruler of the universe to Jesus as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek follows a biblical logic. God invites the Messiah in Psalm 110, verse 1, to sit at his right hand until he submits his enemies. The author discusses the meaning of this passage in chapters 1 through 4. Then, in Psalm 110, verse 4, God appoints the Messiah a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. The author discusses the meaning of this passage in chapters 5 to 10. The argument of chapters 5 to 10 consists of two important sub-arguments. The first sub-argument is developed in Hebrews 5 and 6. There, the author introduces Jesus as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The second sub-argument is developed in Hebrews 7 through 10:18, where the author explains that the inauguration of Jesus' priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek implies that a new covenant between God and Israel has been inaugurated. The first sub-argument is based on God's speech. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, and emphasizes the eternal nature of the priesthood of Christ and its efficacy. The second sub-argument is based on the promise of the new covenant of Jeremiah 31:31-34. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Hebrews explains Jesus' death as the means both of instituting a new covenant as well as of cleansing the conscience or redeeming from transgressions committed. As in the first cycle, Jesus responds to God's speech by committing himself to come into the world to do the will of God. This section closes with the assertion that the forgiveness of sins means that we need not offer any more offerings for sins. The sacrifices of animals carried in the Temple of Jerusalem are now obsolete and therefore should be abandoned. It seems possible that his audience, the audience of the letter, continued to offer sacrifices and consider the Levitical ministry as important for them, without realizing that it contradicted Jesus' priestly work in their behalf and that it could lead them to apostatize from him. New Testament writings do present Jesus as a high priest outside of Hebrews, but this aspect of his role is not developed as explicitly as in Hebrews. It is possible that the author was not trying to introduce his audience to the role of Jesus as high priest in their favor, but trying to help them grasp with more clarity the importance and implications of Jesus' sacrifice and ministry in their favor. The author does not introduce Jesus' priesthood as a second activity, parallel and coexisting with his rule at God's right hand, but as an intrinsic aspect of his rule that they needed to grasp. Jesus is not both king and priest, but a priestly king or a kingly priest. Jesus, as a priest, had several functions. The high priest represented the people before God. He carried in his chest the breastplate of judgment that contained the 12 precious stones with the names of each tribe. Thus, the priest carried the people in his heart and interceded for them. The priest also represented God before the people. It was a teacher of the laws of God and explained to the people how they should be obeyed. Malachi 2 verse 7 says, "For the lips of a priest should guard knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts." The priests were also judges. The high priest was, in fact, the chief justice of the nation. The high priest was also a spokesman for God. He blessed in his name and consulted God through the Urim and Thummim. Jesus fulfilled perfectly all these duties. He is the perfect sacrifice because he is the creator. Since he is the creator of the universe, his death can be valid for all the sins of the universe. He is also our perfect representative because he adopted fully our human nature. He is also the perfect teacher of the law of God, the perfect judge, and the perfect spokesman for God. Most importantly, his priesthood is forever because he lives forever. He is first priest to restore our relationship with God so that we have full access to him. The third section talks about faith persevering till the end. This is the last and most important of the three large sections of Hebrews because it brings to its climax the exhortatory argument, which is the main purpose of the epistle. After having explained the importance of Jesus' enthronement as ruler at the right hand of God and his consecration as priest that inaugurates a new covenant for us, the author exhorts the audience to hold fast to faith because soon, if they endure, they will receive what was promised. This is the main message of the letter to the Hebrews, which the author characterizes as a word of exhortation. This section is divided in two large subsections. The first subsection goes from chapter 10, verse 19 to chapter 12, 29, where God exhorts believers to hold fast to faith and have endurance, because soon a judgment will come that will bring both a reward for the faithful as well as destruction to the enemies. This section climaxes in the warning about God's coming judgment in Hebrews 12, 18 to 29. The second subsection from Hebrews 13, 1 through verse 19 explains that believers should respond to God's message with brotherly love and with following Jesus outside the camp, bearing his reproach, and includes the response of faith by believers. Hebrews was written to a group of believers who were living just before the destruction of Jerusalem, just like we are living before the end of this world. The message of Hebrews is that we need to look unto Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. The author reminds us that Jesus is our King who will protect us and defend us, and that he will lead us into the rest, the heavenly promised land. Jesus is also our priest who offered a perfect sacrifice for us and that intercedes for us in the heavenly sanctuary. He does not only cleanse us, but also provides access into the presence of God, where we will find mercy and help in a time of need. May Jesus be the source of your strength and hope as we wait for the appearance, the second coming of Jesus Christ to this earth. Thank you very much.